So Cameron and I have also been workshopping. We've been taking a close look at Auckland, and you will hear a lot of mission accomplished talk on the fact that Auckland's large-scale upzoning made housing cheaper. I'll show you some charts. We'll look at some of the issues and some of these claims. 2016, a plan change called the zoning change called the Auckland Unitary Plan went through. It was very large in terms of widespread upzoning of land. About 75% of the city by area was upzoned, and the zone capacity, the number of extra houses you could build under the laws, tripled to about 100 years of production. There was a big composition change because townhouses were allowed where they were difficult before, and everybody likes townhouses in Auckland, it seems. So there was something like a 50% increase in the share of attached as opposed to detached housing. And along with that, new houses are significantly smaller than they were before the change, 1/4 smaller. That's quite a staggering change in terms of rate. In Australia, our houses are getting bigger on average. Sure, the apartments are small, but we build bigger and bigger houses in the greenfield, and on average across all dwelling types, our houses are getting larger. Well, in Auckland, the average house for the handful of years before the plan was significantly larger, and since the plan, people have been building really small houses, apartments and townhouses, and the change has been more significant than for the rest of New Zealand. Now, around this time, there was a large construction boom, and median rent growth, and even rent growth generally, was slower than the rest of New Zealand, and based essentially on that fact and a few studies, people have claimed mission accomplished. I'm going to look at some context for that boom and some issues with the studies. And this is the real context, which anyone who comes from New Zealand will know something about the wild cycles in New Zealand population. So Australia is a fast-growing country, right? But on average, across a very long period, you've been hovering between about 1% and 2% per year. That's population growth rate. New Zealand gets as low as 0.5. Oh dear, something's gone kooky with my chart, but no worries. It's about 0.5 for a few years sometimes. That's just natural population increase, that. And sometimes it's up above 2%. And what happened around the time, or just before the Auckland Unitary Plan, was a massive spike in population growth. And for these years here, from about 2014 through to COVID, New Zealand was the fastest growing country in the OECD, except for Luxembourg, asterisks, and Luxembourg, yeah, go to Luxembourg. Everybody is. And New Zealand's population growth on average was 40% faster than Australia. So you thought Australia was a fast growing country over the last decade or so. Well, New Zealand's even faster, right? So that's inevitably going to, a lot of people require housing, right? People are going to build housing. They're all arriving in Auckland, 3 times larger than New Zealand's next biggest city, New Zealand's major migrant port, the only place you can fly direct to, most places. So, right, that's the context, and in essence, that tripling of the population growth rate was always going to spur a boom, and to isolate the effect of the actual policy change on the boom on construction is difficult. So the first and key paper was about that construction rate, and the comparison was essentially upzoned areas to non-upzoned areas, and the finding was something like 22,000 extra dwellings are caused by the policy change, or in other words, about 25% of dwellings permitted or approved, building approvals, were thanks to the policy change. It's a big and bold claim. It's also built on some really sketchy methods, and I'll talk through them. There was a biased sample of all consents, and that sample creates what's a fake structural break in the data, and there's a huge policy effect that's a contrived outcome of selecting your data judiciously or carefully, or maybe carelessly. The counterfactual, what would have happened otherwise, that's the essence of policy evaluation. You need to say what would have happened without your policy. And the counterfactual was just built on straight line extrapolation, like you're a high school economics student. Oh, it's just extrapolate a straight line, ignoring the fact these things are massively cyclical. And the final point, but it's maybe a lesser point, is that the thing they say this is the impact of upzoning on housing construction. It's not. It's the impact of housing on upzoning on housing approvals or consents, and the rate at which those consents are converted to homes can vary and is slowing. So this is from the Financial Review, and it shows the areas that were upzoned in blue and the areas that were not upzoned in orange, and bang, at the reform date, skyrocketing. It's like there's never been a clearer effect of a policy than this. Problem? Here's the problem. My chart's gone funky again. Problem is the full data set just grows steadily, and they pulled out the grey data, which was growing rapidly and shrunk afterwards, and the remaining data that was part of their study had this so-called structural break, a kink in the data. And that's entirely contrived because the full data set is just steady growth, and the data they used in their sample has explosive growth. And they said, well, growth exploded. We got explosive growth. Yeah, because you pulled out the other like imploding part of the data series. So what's going on is certain permit types or dwelling approval types were growing rapidly, certain areas, certain permit types, and then after the upzoning of other areas, there was less demand to build in these areas and using these dwelling approval types. And so there was, if you like, a substitution of demand into certain areas. Okay, so, right. That substitution happened, and it means that this increase is not a good guide to the total across all of Auckland. That's a big problem. Second problem, apart from skewing the data set, is that here's the total number of approvals in Auckland, and it's cyclical. Well, they just took a subset of that data and they straight line extrapolated it. And here's what they said would have happened without the policy, essentially the pink line. Technically the orange line, but it's built on the pink line. So in other words, you're rising along in New Zealand's fastest population boom since, I don't know, but fastest growth in the OECD around 2014. Auckland's increasing its building permits at 21% per year, and you're saying suddenly that growth rate would have been 4% per year. And that's just implausible. It just doesn't pass any sniff test that midway through a massive population boom, there'll be a sudden slowdown in building activity. Where are the people going to go? There's no rationale for this other than embedded in the assumptions. You've got to dig to, Appendix 3.2. Embedded in the assumptions, you see that, holy shit, or pardon me, they just straight line extrapolated a portion of the sample. It's surrounded by a lot of math, and we had to dig pretty deep. I think everyone knows it's BS, actually, in New Zealand. They just can't admit it's BS. Anyway, you get the point, really. If you want to see what happened in another city that wasn't upzoned, here's the Wellington region. Now, there's some quibblers that will say, oh, Wellington did upzone. Well, they got rid of some kind of parking minimum here, and they did something about here after the boom was basically over. But essentially, the claim is Auckland would have kind of flatlined around here, despite the non-upzoned city that's famously hard to build housing in, booming. Auckland's boom looks exactly like Wellington's boom, and it's very unlikely the impact of the policy was as significant as spoken. This is all methods. There you go. 2016, imagine the Auckland Unitary Plan doesn't come through, and there's a New Zealand's biggest population boom ever. Would you bet that the line would grow like line D, or more like C or B? Well, no, you got it wrong. They did that. Okay, a few other results that are way too technical, so let's not worry about them. Second method looked at the same question, construction rates, and it did so by comparing Auckland to a control city, but not any specific city, a weighted basket of other cities that's supposedly representative of Auckland. That's called a synthetic control. And they find a huge policy impact. About half of the building approvals issued were due to the policy. Again, a really sketchy, pessimistic counterfactual. So in black, here's that Auckland true data series, the actuals. And in orange, here's what they said would have happened based on these apparently comparable cities. Would have sort of got to here, then flatlined, tapped out. The issues are, in brief, over this period here, the time of the huge boom, population growth was 30% faster than during the last big boom of the early 2000s. But the claim is that without the Auckland Unitary Plan, the rate of the permits per capita would have been half that pertaining over here. About 10 permits per 1,000 residents in the 2000s boom, should be down at about 5 permits per 1,000 residents in the subsequent boom, despite population growth growing so fast. It's ridiculous. population grows, people want housing, rents rise, people build housing. That's how the economy works. We haven't really fully unpacked exactly why this creates such a counterintuitive outcome, but it's probably related to the fact that no matter how they construct it, multiple specifications, they end up with two cities comprising the vast majority of their control basket. Two cities that happened to look like Auckland before the reform. There's Tauranga, which is about 10% the size of Auckland, and there's Kapiti, which is essentially a retirement village. It's near Wellington where I live. Kapiti Coast, I don't even think it has a centre. It probably has a supermarket, but it's like 3% of the population of Auckland. And the idea that this should be somehow a comparable city to New Zealand, a 1.7 million population city is kind of mad. It's like saying Brisbane is best predicted not by Sydney or Melbourne, but by, I don't know, 50% Noosa and 50% Rockhampton, right? So it stretches some plausibility. All right. Okay, next paper was about whether upzoning reduced rents, and I'll move quickly. Again, they used a synthetic control. And here's what went on. Oh no, my crazy charts. Here's New Zealand's three main cities, Auckland, Wellington, Christchurch, or Canterbury region. This is rents right from the start of the data series in 2006. And rents, they converge. The story of this data set is that rents between cities that are competing for New Zealand residents converge, and they never get too far from each other over time. Christchurch got expensive because all the housing fell down in the earthquake. People left Christchurch. Rents came off when buildings started to grow. Wellington got expensive when the Labour government was elected and put in a lot of public servants. I know, because I had to compete with them for housing, right? And then eventually everybody left Wellington. They went to Christchurch. And Christchurch, which was cheaper than the other cities, got more expensive when people moved from Wellington. This is just how it works. It's called spatial equilibrium. You can plot that chart for Australian cities, you get the same thing. It's intuitive, it's obvious, its migration is so-called endogenous, responds to prices. And here's what the authors found based on their synthetic control would have happened if not for Auckland's upzoning. Auckland would have diverged massively like that. And that just has no precedent in history. It's inconsistent with theory. I get they did a method to do this. Something's wrong with the method, right? It's like the engineer looking at a bridge that's fallen down saying the design was perfect. No, it fell down. The design's not perfect, right? So, and here, if you like to take housing costs to income, which is a very stable ratio, people on average spend 25, 30%, differs across cities, but it's a very stable ratio through time. And in Auckland, it's been stable. It was New Zealand's most expensive city, 25% of income. It's still New Zealand's most expensive city at about 25% income. You can't see the apparent rent decrease in that data, but apparently without the Unitary plan, the rents would have been up to historically unprecedented levels, but it just can't survive. Okay, going to go even faster through these ones. This one's just really sketchy. I've just explained that upzoning land makes the price of land go up because you've got a redevelopment option, a premium associated with redevelopment. It's windfall gains, right? Plausibly, if upzoning's going to spur supply, you as a landowner are worried about a flood of supply coming on. And you think, shit, I don't want to hold housing anymore. I'm going to sell it. I'm going to pay less for it. So there might be a depreciative effect of the anticipated flood of future supply. And the authors set out to test whether the redevelopment premium pushing land prices up or house prices up would exceed the supply effect, the anticipated supply effect pushing houses down. And they made this sort of conclusion that, well, it depends. But intensively developed properties, that's like a high structure value relative to capital value. The value is mostly in the building, not the land. Those properties actually decrease in value. They get cheaper. House prices go down relative to non-upzoned properties, showing that the large-scale upzoning had an immediate depreciative effect on pre-existing intensive, capital-intensive housing. Okay, that's in the abstract, no numbers in the abstract, but a claim that sometimes they go up, sometimes they go down. Upzoning might have made some houses cheaper. Wonderful, right? It's also BS because in the relevant range of intensity of development, there is no data. And when you dig, as we did, we found that according to their own stats, 99% of houses that were upzoned went up in value by an average 6% versus the non-upzoned houses. and only 1% of upzoned houses fell in value, and that's by an average 1% compared to non-upzoned houses. And the baseline growth, the background growth for those non-upzoned houses was plus 67% over 6 years. So what you're saying, when you're saying upzoning in Auckland made housing cheaper, you're saying 1% of upzoned houses went up by 66% instead of 67%. Does that sound like housing affordability miracle to you? Or does that sound like essentially misreporting of your data in the abstract? So we're miffed about that one. And there's the method, basically. Like, there's not much over here. Here's the cutoff for the structure value to capital value ratio. And on this side of the line, there's no data. There's no houses in here. Okay, this is just weird. They also used a synthetic control of Auckland and other cities to claim that upzoning led to more public housing. Now, public housing is a public decision. It's an investment decision. You can look at the cabinet papers. You can look at the operational docs for the department. You wouldn't typically look at other cities as your way to discern how upzoning, by reducing the unit costs of housing production, may have spurred on more housing. And it's bizarre and it's silly because just around the same time as the upzoning, in response to that massive population growth and all the homelessness, the Public Housing Agency launched an Auckland-specific housing program to build heaps more houses. So the idea that 7,000 of the 10,000 homes they eventually delivered would not have arrived without the upzoning is ridiculous, because this is a public decision. Government departments don't respond to price incentives like a private actor. And it's just kind of, it's Flight of the Conchords surreal. Flight of the Conchords level surreal to imagine you would understand the influence of one policy on another policy by doing a synthetic control instead of just looking at the document trail. So, bit mad. And this is the final one, and it's, I mentioned the Alonzo Muff Mills model of urban density. Well, this paper, published paper, said we are evaluating the long-run effects of zoning reform on urban development and finding that there will be an approximate 24% increase in floor space in Auckland, and that implies that prices in Auckland would be, or will be, 15 to 27%, or would be higher if not further policy under the counterfactual. Now, the real weird thing about this is that it's a forward-looking projection. It's a simulation exercise, a spreadsheet forecasting exercise looking at the future. And it's being framed as an evaluation. Oh no! It's being framed as an evaluation. These bits here that should be highlights, but clearly we got, it's PowerPoint compatibility issues. This says, yeah, that's right, censorship. Yeah, yellow band censorship, right? The yellow band is just unspoken, right? This says develops a theoretical framework for assessing the effect of zoning reform on Auckland. Assessing, okay, that implies it's already happened, right? Applies the method to evaluate a widespread zoning reform on Auckland. If you know anything about evaluation, you will know that evaluation usually means looking back at things that actually happened. It doesn't mean predicting what will happen and saying, wow, well done everybody, right? Upzoning, I think, generated an approximate 24% increase in floor space supply. That hasn't arrived yet. Supply generates that fall in house prices. Okay, all these outcomes are simulations yet to eventuate, and they're being passed off as an evaluation. That's like verging on dishonest, all right? And verging on dishonest as well is our bonus episode, which is the Auckland Council Chief Economist. I emailed the guy and said, you've got an error, just a typographical error in your paper. Right, the census data came out, and they compared the ratio of how many extra dwellings were built compared to how many extra people arrived by geographic area, and said that amongst the cities, Auckland and Lower Hutt, which had some kind of upzoning, had the highest ratios of extra dwellings to extra people, dwellings per additional 100 people, and both have upzoned, let's say, benefited from increased flexibility. Fantastic. It looks like there's a smoking gun that this jurisdiction here did amazingly, and this jurisdiction here, more evidence of that upzone makes housing cheaper. Here's one problem. Wellington City, which might be that one there, should be on that map, maybe is not on the map, it's where I live. Between these census dates, the population was zero. The population growth was zero. In fact, it went down by 46 people, right? For some reason, people left Wellington between those dates. And Wellington built, I don't know, 3, 4, 5% extra dwellings. So the ratio of dwelling growth to population growth for Wellington was infinity, right? So Wellington was the outperforming city that built more houses to accommodate its new population compared to everywhere, including Auckland and Lower Hutt. Wellington should be right here with a very dark brown, purpley colour saying, wow, whatever they're doing in Wellington, it's great. They're building houses even when people don't arrive, right? They just left it off the map. They didn't mention it in their thing. They somehow hid that stat. Extremely sketchy. And let's not worry about that. It's making the point that really, if you think this metric of dwelling stock growth versus population growth is a good metric, you need to acknowledge that London did better than Auckland, San Francisco did better than Auckland, Wellington region did better than Auckland. Maybe it's not a good metric after all. And the way it was presented is extremely misleading. Ooh, and that's the stuff we've been doing in Auckland, and that's like basically the end of the prezzo, I guess. Thanks for letting me get into the flow. Sorry. Cheers.